Do not walk in the darkness. Thank you for joining me. I'm Pastor J. Dillon Proctor, and today we're going to be going to the book of Ecclesiastes. And this is our second study in that series. And we're going to be looking in chapter 2 at verse 14, where it says, "The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness." Now you read this at first, and there seems like there's a pretty big contrast between the wise man and the fool. That the fool is walking in darkness, and that's a very real thing. I don't think that in the church we spend enough time emphasizing the potency and severity of deception. Here in the modern world, and this is true in every sphere of life, we've bought into the idea that things are only as true as we want them to be. Perhaps I believe my girlfriend is cheating on me, so I'm going to have my suspicion confirmed when I come home and there are 2 bags of chips on the table instead of 1, and I think she's had someone over. Or I think that it must be true that the hero or the celebrity I want did something really impressive, so when I hear on the news that this politician that I love, they actually turned out to be, victorious in whatever, then I agree with it, even though it's a total lie and scam. We have a tendency in the modern age to only believe something if I can personally find it agreeable, I can pay the price, it's convenient for me to believe. It doesn't put me at all in a risk. I don't have to actually reorganize life around it. It's very simple. And therefore, the darkness has a great power over all of us, because as long as we live in the realm of comfort, we'll go along with it. But truth doesn't work that way. So when you read something like Ecclesiastes 2, and Ecclesiastes is a very serious book. It's actually an incredibly stimulating book that takes you to the edge of your chair and reminds you not to just look at more serious thoughts in your mind, but actually takes you to a place where you look at hardship and has real, serious, deep conversations about meaning in life. And so this opening statement here contrasts the fool and the wise man, that the fool is actually walking in the darkness and the wise man has some sort of eyesight. And you read that and you think, okay, well, I need to make sure that I'm a wise man and not a fool. But then there's a problem. And Ecclesiastes brings us to that too, because it's not so easy. Darkness is a powerful thing, and it will come for the wise men as well. And this is what you find here in Ecclesiastes. Continuing that verse, it says, "The wise man's eyes are in his head, the fool walketh in darkness. And I myself perceived that one event happened to them all. And I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, so it happens even to me. And was I then more wise?" Again, this is Solomon writing this, who's, again, the scripture's holy writ, so it's, ordained and revealed by God. It is the precious word revealed to us. But Solomon, from his kind of eyes here and lens, he says, I'm a wise man. How am I any better than the fool? Because there's one event that happens to them both. And you can probably guess what that event is, though I'll spell it out here in a moment. There is one event that happens both to the fool and the wise man. And then I said in my heart, this too must all be vanity. For there is no remembrance of the wise man any more for the fool ever, seeing that now in the days to come all will be forgotten. And how dieth the wise man? He dies the same as the fool. And therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit. So death comes from it all. Decay comes from it all. There's nothing in this world which is exempt from decay and destruction, and we really have to appreciate that. In our world, the sad fact of the matter is that the spirit of the age, meaning the spirit of deception, the spirit of evil, and corruption, has truly infected every institution around us, including the church, including things like the medical establishment, politics. There are unique examples of people being righteous in all of those fields, but as a given, we have to appreciate that sin has entered into the equation, and it's not just over there. We gave up the public sphere of our society to kind of have this idea of like a secular humanist world. And what happened is we ended up giving everything over to the spirit of the age. It's now been given over to a mind of reprobation and depravity. And so deception is real. The darkness is out there. And whether you are wise or a fool, you'll actually all end up in the same place if, and this is where you find this great truth built into Ecclesiastes. When Solomon says, I hated life because every work that is under the sun is grievous unto me, that is true. Everything that is here under the sun, here on earth, will be vanity unless it is actually beyond the earth, unless we're doing things of eternal importance. This also harkens to a similar line of thought as you find in 1 Corinthians 13, where, everything will pass away. The wisdom of man will pass away. Philosophies, they'll pass away. But love is the one thing that actually has some eternal value. Like all things will pass away. Knowledge, wisdom, deeds, everything passes away. Great works, small works. But the things of eternal matter, those are the things which will persevere. And so in our world, we do have a problem of people walking in the darkness. I was texting a friend this morning, and I realized that if you don't have an acquired taste for the spirit of the age, and that's kind of the name I'm giving to this, it's a biblical language you see Paul using, kind of the deception that will come over a whole generation. If you just buy into the failed method of thought, which is everywhere in our society, that it's all about perspectives, like you can go and listen to all the different perspectives and you'll pick what is best. Like, well, there's wisdom in a multitude of counsel. We'll kind of look at that scripture, or we'll buy some version of that and kind of throw away all the scriptures that say deception is out there, and actually you'll sear your conscience if you listen to deceivers or insincere thoughts. If you listen to people that come with a flawed premise, that you'll actually not be hearing counsel. We take that statement from Proverbs and say, all perspectives are counsel. No, they're not. Actually, anything separated from God is actually going to tear you down. You actually aren't as immortal equipped to sit down and listen to all the perspectives and decide what's good and true, because it's very possible for you to believe a thing sounds good. And especially if you don't spend a lot of time working with your hands and getting immediate feedback, it's very easy to believe that something is good and true when in fact it is very corrupting. And in our world, we generally only have enough technical knowledge to think that we're omniscient, meaning all powerful, we're omnipotent, we're omnipresent. We tend to have only enough technical knowledge to think that we know everything, to get ourselves into a trap when we really don't. So the question that I have for us today is, do you walk in the darkness? The church that cannot be distinguished from the world is no church at all. And if it heeds after the patterns, solutions, and wisdoms of the world, then it's not merely in the world, but clearly of it. And so a lot of times in the church, you'll see people say, well, these social movements, they're bad. Things like the sexual revolution are bad. But yet we really do need to redesign how men and women relate to one another. And that's actually a big problem. You've bought the premise of the sexual revolution, and you're going to end up at the same place. Back to the language of the spirit of the age. If you don't have the taste for it, anytime you go to eat a meal, if you don't have the ability to taste the poison in that food, you're going to eat it all, and you're eventually going to succumb to the poison. The spirit of the age, the corrupt ideas, we have to have the skill set to be able to taste it whenever we're, again, ingesting the information and material of the world. And whenever the spirit of the age is in it, to spit it out whole cloth. Don't do anything with those ideas, those words. You're not going to beat the devil at his own game. You'll only succumb to his flaws. So you see a lot of people say, well, these social movements, they're bad. But yet the premise is good. These activists, they have their solutions totally wrong, but yet we do need to sit down and talk about the issue they brought to us. Like, no, that's actually how deception works. The two goals that deception really has for you is, one, to give you a different impression of things and people in the world, to make you think certain things are more important than they are, or to necessarily draw attention to one thing, which might be a real flaw. But again, we're not actually omniscient. We're not capable of seeing and weighing and measuring every event that goes on in everyone else's life. And you could really find on anyone a moment of someone saying something poor, in poor character saying something. It's funny that the modern news media has a big emphasis on what someone said and a very small emphasis on what people actually do. We have, sadly, a great many people in the church who are completely fine with doing evil, but very offended when people speak in bad character. We forgot that doing evil is bad character. We tend to think that bad character is just speaking brashly. I'm very worried that we have a great many people in the church that would be more offended at Elijah mocking the prophets of Baal than the actual idolatry of the prophets of Baal. And that's not a good thing to do. That's how you've been kind of given over to your reprobate mind. We have to be people who can see. So, which also means waking up every day and praying. And I recommend praying, Psalm 26, which says, judge me, O Lord. Judge me. Actually show me where I'm at. I've walked in mine integrity. I've hated your enemies. Judge me so I know where I really stand and I have the good character to see. Every day we should be praying that we have eyes to see, because a lot of people in our world don't. And if people don't have eyes to see, if they haven't learned to acquire the taste of what the spirit of the age tastes like when they're consuming something, then they're not going to realize that they're going along with the patterns, solutions, and the wisdom of the world. So when we come to this, the issue of deception, a little story that I want to share with this, and I may use it in the future. I've bought recently a saxophone that I'm rebuilding. It's the rarest saxophone I've ever seen. It's a little tiny soprano sax, but it's not one pitched in B flat like they normally are. It's pitched in C. It's an old C soprano sax. They only made a few of them in kind of the 1910s and 1920s. And I bought this. It's a Bushel True Tone saxophone, which is really super cool. I'm not going to nerd out on the details, but it was bent. So the saxophone itself, it's supposed to be straight, but it's got a curve to it. It's bent. And this is one of the things where you can straighten them out. You take them and put them on a lathe with like a mandrel or something like that and kind of hammer a cone inside of it, and it'll bend the metal right. Well, it's very hard to find one for that model of saxophone because it's so rare, and it's a different shape and different angle than other ones. So rather than me trying to hunt down someone in the United States who actually has a mandrel for that, or paying an exorbitant amount of money to have one made, I decided to 3D print one. Even though it's not metal, I thought, I'll make this. So I've made the tools to fix the saxophone. And slowly but surely, I've put them inside there and hammered it in there, and it's straightening out the metal. And I get to a point where there's just a very slight bend left in it. And I was very, very, excited about my work and the success I had. And I took it over to some family members' house, and it was like, hey, look at this cool thing. Like, it's actually getting straight. These 3D printed tools are actually fixing the problem. And I consulted a few people, chiefly my grandmother, some others as well, but the story relates to my conversation with her. And I said, it's almost completely straight. Do I want to go one further? Do I want to print an even longer tool? Because again, I was working my way longer and longer, and it was getting straighter and straighter. Gradually kind of working through it. And I said, do I want to go one more tool? I think if I make one more, I can get it completely straight. And she said, well, that metal's got to be thin up there at the top of the saxophone. And I said, well, no, it's all made from a sheet, so the brass is the same thickness throughout it. And she was like, yeah, but it's got to be more fragile. I was kind of like, well, it's the same thickness. I was like, it should be fine. So I went and I 3D print my mandrel, and I'm hammering it in the saxophone, and it gets brilliantly straight. It looks beautiful. And then the register key, which sends it up an octave, the tone hole for the register key pops out. It's soldered in, and I forgot that unique among the holes in the saxophone, the register keys, the register vents, they actually have a little shaft that goes inside the saxophone. It doesn't work like the others, and there's actually a tube inside the other tube, and lo and behold, it popped it out. So my grandmother was right. Now, she was technically wrong in the sense that she was not aware of the tone holes. And like the whole assumption that the metal's thinner at the top is wrong in technicality, but the sentiment, like the instinct that it gets more dangerous at the smaller end of the saxophone, was correct. Her instinct was correct, even though her technical explanation of the instinct was wrong. And on my end, my technical analysis of the situation was correct, but in reality, I was the one who was wrong, utterly wrong too. Like to the point of now I'm going to have to resolder that tone hole, which isn't a big deal. It's totally repairable. And I love the fact that I've even got a great story out of it. But oftentimes in life, we have enough technical details that are correct to analyze a situation completely wrong. And we'll point to other people that we know they have the technical details wrong, but they're actually correct. And this is one of the ways that we're oftentimes deceived. A.W. Tozier, and I don't quote a lot of other writers and things, but A.W. Tozier has a great line that says, when the church is backsliding, that's when it starts emphasizing education. And he's entirely correct. Our modern world, if a pastor is to, have a spiritual deepening thing, they're sent off to a camp or a retreat. I almost despise the word retreat. Because it's of course it's obviously very effeminate, but it's also a very don't work with your hands. And by don't work with your hands, don't bleed, don't bust your knuckles, don't break a saxophone while you're working on it. It's a very low risk, low skill, it's a low skill thing, right? You go around and you listen to people talk about things in theory, and the problem is our theories are very bad. Like we'll pretend to know the culture or sociological facts of a saint in the Bible, and therefore that gives us kind of an arrogant presumption. And it's a very high form of arrogance that presents itself very nicely and very kindly. It has a great measured tone to it, but we forget that it can be completely wrong. that your technical assessment of things might be utterly irrelevant and entirely wrong. But when you work with your hands, you're actually reminded that sometimes the things which get the technical details wrong, like my grandmother's analysis of the saxophone, she did not have the technical details correct about the thickness of the saxophone, but her instinct about the fragility of it was intact, correct. She actually had the correct analysis with the wrong technical details, and me, who had the correct technical details, had the wrong analysis. That happens a lot. And when you work with your hands, you're reminded of the truth, because the truth is not actually born in the technicality. The truth is bigger than all of that. The truth is quite mysterious. And in our modern world, we as Christians, we cannot follow the patterns of the world, the solutions of the world, or the wisdom of the world, which in many ways means don't use the vocabulary of the world. A lot of the words in our world are more or less incantations to bewitch people. Some specific words are like that, are like diversity, unity, togetherness, a lot of this stuff, the cheap platitudes. You actually sit down and study what these words mean, like diversity. You study its etymology. It actually means subjectivity. It means pluralism. It's actually a word which means multiple truths, a split or broken truth. It's actually totally incompatible with the idea of there being a unified, universal truth, meaning there's a universal and absolute God. In the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs 20, twice it talks about how diverse weights are an abomination to the Lord. And I always took a joke in saying, the few times you actually see that word in Scripture, it's actually used with abominations. And when you actually study what that word means, it actually does mean things which are broken and truthless. And it's no coincidence that when you see things that use that language, they are given over to the spirit of the age. They are things which are subjective, things which believe they can choose the moral boundaries of life a la carte, that we can explain the technical details, that we can find a way for, say, men and women to have happiness outside of marriage, which again is incredibly materialistic. Like we think that we can have careers that'll somehow bring satisfaction to people. We buy into kind of science as a religion, and that's capital S science, which is also, lowercase demon science, in the sense that it's not actually observation of truth or knowledge, which is what that word means in Latin, knowledge, but it's more or less nescience. It's conjuring things up. It's much more akin to the old alchemy and witchcraft. And we buy into this stuff. We buy into these narratives, and we've ended up trusting institutions which are neither of God nor moving towards Him. And this is where, I know I like to teach English and literature, and here's where I turn into the literature kook who talks about prepositions. But prepositions matter. You're a living creature. You're going somewhere. To sit idle is to be going down. You cannot sit still. You are a live creature. And between the wise men and the fool, they both go to the same place if they are separated from God. You can't have magic rules. You can't educate your way out of sin. You can't educate your way out of foolishness even. That's the thing which is fascinating. Foolishness, to really understand that word, is not an inability to learn or an absence of learning, but it's actually an insistence on learning wrong things. Real foolishness is doubling down on learning wrong things. It's that insisting that knowledge which is not knowledge is actually knowledge, even though it's not. I mean, it's basically what God says in Job 38:1, who shows up and saying, who darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Foolishness is words without knowledge. And the truth is that things can be empty. Your technical details, which are correct, can actually be wrong, because life requires prepositions. When you take the technical details of the thickness of the saxophone and you apply it to life and you move forwards with the repair process and you forget about some element that wasn't there, it totally changes it all. And I'm being a little bit reckless with this microphone. But God alone makes the good, and we're fallen creatures, period. Those are the only real magic rules that are out there. God alone makes the good, and you're a fallen creature. And to that end, a liar may accidentally reveal the truth, and the wise man be swept away in lust. We've been trusting in things which are incapable of actually being measurements in society. For too long, we've beaten around the bush and conjured up magic rules about what makes the good. Like when it comes to some sort of, differences between people, we try to have all these rules about disparities and things to come up with technical details. Even with trying to pass on virtues like our American heritage, we come up with technical details like, freedom of speech or the right to bear arms or bodily autonomy. Even when people kind of go back and forth about, things about abortion or being forced to take a shot, which is very, very obviously sold with coercion and deception. And people will want to say, on one hand, bodily autonomy is good, and on the other hand, body autonomy is, not good or whatever. But that's actually the wrong framing of the whole argument. Neither one of those things are actually about bodily autonomy. They're about what is good, true, and beautiful. And we try to have these like theoretical arguments and formulas you can apply to different situations in life, and there's actually no virtue tethered to any of that at all. Like, death is bad. Killing someone wantonly, willingly and knowingly killing someone, a child. Scripture talks a lot. Isaiah 49, Psalm 139, about God knowing you while you're in the womb, caring about you. Even before your members are made, God knows and loves you. Again, you even go to Matthew 18. Jesus says, woe to those who put stumbling blocks before these little ones. He's speaking very literally there. In the modern world, we're so used to everything being a symbol that we can't see reality when it's before our eyes. We're very bad at observing the world before us. We don't pay attention to what's really happening. And that kind of goes back to the brainwashing that's done by the modern media. And that's including things like Facebook and Instagram and, of course, the newspapers. But the idea that we care more about what people say than what they do. C.S. Lewis actually puts in the Paralandra, the villain Weston who's possessed by the devil. He is wholeheartedly evil, and he doesn't bother with defying the good at all. He ignores what is good to the point of annihilation. The beast in Revelation 13, when he comes out of the sea, he doesn't bother with acknowledging God. He doesn't acknowledge God in his blasphemy until after the whole earth has worshipped him and they've all been swooned and swept away in the deception. But while he's coming into power, he pretends like he's the most ordinary thing at all. There's no fact checkers to say that he's bad. There's no one with a strong reaction that says, oh my gosh, did you hear what the beast said? There's none of that. It's none of that at all. It's just presented to you like it's the most ordinary thing that there ever has been. And in our modern world, we're very bad. As long as it's presented to us as being an ordinary thing, we think that it's okay. When that's not the case at all. We're all capable of being deceived. And we've trusted in institutions which are neither of God nor moving towards God. In the church, we've moved away from actually talking about sin to being in the realm of theory, where you don't actually have to deal with the nuances and complications of life. It's much easier to talk about the sociological structure of the ancient Jewish world than to actually talk about what happened in the ancient Jewish world, right? It's much easier to talk about the social dynamics between, say, or what we think are the social dynamics, say, between different tribes. Or we might say with Jesus, the people were expecting a warlike Messiah. It's easier to talk about that than to say, well, the teachers of the law were sinners, and they didn't like Jesus challenging their authority. Because when you actually sit down and Jesus discerns and perceives and tells us what's going on in the hearts of these people who reject him, exactly 0 of them reject him because he wasn't a David warlike Messiah. None of them reject him for that, though it's often taught that that's one of the expectations that people were surprised by. And you actually see a lot of people, kind of the poor people of society, who see Jesus do miracles. They see things that Jesus, says and does, and they say, oh, that's the Son of David. They actually do recognize the more miracle-working, prophetic, loving man as the Messiah. They actually are a lot of people who do see and honor that. And there is exactly 0 people who reject Jesus because he's not the warlike Messiah. That's actually what the New Testament tells you. But you see it actually taught in the inverse of that, because it's easier to talk about the theory than to actually sit down with people and say, you know what? We're all capable of being the Pharisees. We're all capable of being the teachers who are wise in our own eyes. Pointing out the fact that the reason that Jesus is rejected by the Pharisees and Sadducees is because he has real authority, not their officiality. Well, that's an indictment on officiality across the board. That there can be things which are branded as experts, that are branded as being authorities, that have great credentials, that everybody applauds from them when their biography is read, that you can have people that have that great list behind them and they be utter fools. Like we don't really want our modern world to let that be known, that you can actually have somebody, say it's a real estate agent who's been doing it for 40 years and they're actually terrible at their job. Like we like to think that your perspective or your experience or your credentials actually mean something. And in an honest world, they should, right? They should. But our modern age has quit actually weighing things out by their fruit. We talk about the cruelty of giving children participation trophies, and we oftentimes will poke fun at little kids and say, oh, that generation was weaned on participation trophies, so they're all drunk. Well, who gave them the participation trophies? The adults gave them that were doing that in their own lives. The leaders and experts, the people who give out the diplomas, the people who give out ordination certificates were doing it in their own lives. People who had networked into their positions. People who had, just been there for 20 or 40 years without any merit. They had been giving participation trophies to themselves, and then they went and passed that on to the children. Like, that's something which actually happened over time, right? It didn't just manifest out of nowhere that these little children demanded having participation trophies. No, that's a sin of the adults. It's a cruel thing that was been done to children. That was taught to them. They didn't ask for it. Now, again, people are sinners, and even as little children will ask for things that we ought not have. But it's the adults who permitted that to happen. And as a society, we've changed real virtue for now fake virtues and narratives, which are all curated for us like displays in a museum. But God wants us to have something more than that. The alternative to all of this is, of course, God. Real sacred, real holiness. Like, have we appreciated the fact that holy things matter? A girl that I'm teaching right now, I love our time together. We read a ton of books. A couple of weeks ago, I was doing something. We were reading Beowulf out loud. So maybe this was last week. I can't remember. And something came to my mind, and I dropped the book Beowulf on the ground, and then had to write something down because my mind gets a little bit crazy sometimes. And today, while we were reading out of the Gospel of Luke, we got done with that, and she went to set it on the couch, and the Bible slipped off. And it really wasn't her fault, so she wasn't being crude or rude. But the Bible falling on the floor, I was like, oh, don't let the Bible on the floor. And we kind of laughed about it. She's like, oh, I didn't mean to do that. She picks up the Bible. But there's a difference between dropping Beowulf on the floor and dropping a Bible on the floor. But do most of us in the modern world appreciate that? I mean, sure. Even what I did with Beowulf, I kind of willfully allowed Beowulf to be hit the ground, where in her case it was an accident. But at the same time, it's more important to actually treat the Bible as being sacred than it is to treat Beowulf as being sacred. Now I love Beowulf, but things are holy and sacred. Virtue is sacred. When it comes to things like marriage, we treat this all very flippantly. When we come to treating life and being, born with the breath of life, we treat that very flippantly, very casually. But these are sacred things. They're precious things. And yeah, life is a hardship. Life is filled with a lot of difficult things. But yet it is a precious thing. It's good. It's true. It's beautiful. And when it comes to the nature of God, who is beyond even how we might appreciate, say, even the sacredness of the Holy Scriptures, God, whose nature would then give us the Holy Scriptures, right? So it's even further up the hierarchy of sacred than that. And again, the Bible is one of the greatest gifts put in human hands. As far as the written word and philosophy and knowledge and truth goes, it is the greatest thing put in our hands. But then, of course, the blood of Christ on the cross is what actually brings that eternal salvation. So there is you got to be able to put things in their place, but the Holy Scriptures are a precious and irreplaceable thing. Having a sanctuary in your church and treating that as a holy thing, having beautiful windows, organizing your house, having your car put together, these things are important. Like having real good character, which doesn't just mean having a good tone. In fact, you should have what is called temperance. The cardinal virtue. You should meet situations with what is worthy of them. Going back to Psalm 26, you should hate the enemies of God. You should confront the enemies of God. If not, you will be ruled by the enemies of God. And that's what's happened to us. And so the church has gone to teaching, emphasizing education, not because we actually want to be a people who are wiser or more literate, but because we prefer to be in the realm of make-believe theory, which may have no connection to reality at all. Sometimes it does. And usually for maximum chaos, it has just enough connection to reality that people can permit it to stay around, even though a lot of it is in fact untethered to reality and is more poisonous than not. Like the whole maximum chaos thing is the devil's game. If it were out and out bad, then people would dismiss it. But it has enough, value in it that people will make an argument to keep it around, even though it's overall very corrupting. And that happens when you move away from actually dealing with the things in life themselves and you try to make arguments that beat around the bush. And to get back to the idea that there is the sacred, that there is something which is transcendent, that's a mysterious thing, right? You can't explain it away, and a lot of heresies come when people do try to explain it away. But coming to peace with the fact that there are things which are good, true, and beautiful, that's a powerful thing. It's a hard thing in our world. It's a hard thing in our world when we're filled with sin. The number one thing that brings meaning to you in life, as far as human-to-human affairs go, is your family. Our modern world is taken to tear down the family. It's come to young women and said, go out and have a career. You won't be happy with that. It's come to young men and said, go play video games, look at pornography, do that sort of thing. Don't actually go out and talk to a girl because you'll be called sexist or catcalling or something like that. All of these things are very unhappy, and that's a specific emotion, unhappiness. We don't use that word hapless or unhappy much anymore, but that's its own word. And to actually see the goodness of God brings a deeper and richer beauty. It's something which spurs loyalty and liege and words which we don't use much more in the modern lexicon because we've kind of been massaged to sleep. When Moses is born, his parents look at the child and they notice that it's a goodly child. That's the language in the King James. And Brother John, Pastor John, who's here with me at Jolton, he's doing a Sunday school lesson on that. And, he emphasized how this is the same word that you see used in Genesis when God creates all heaven and earth and it's declared good. We don't appreciate what that is. That's not a technical detail being good. You can't even begin to explain it or confine it in exegesis or theory or criticism. You can't. It doesn't exist in that realm. It's beyond it. It's something which is more closely understood in the realm of poetry, but even that is limited by human standards. But they look at the child and it's a goodly child. Another old word we don't use much, another beautiful word that should come back, goodly. The child is good, true, and beautiful. And that's my best understanding of the word tov, is to use that phrasing of it is the good, the true, the beautiful. And that's above and beyond just merely being enough. It's beyond needs or wants. In fact, it's very dangerous. Creation is quite deliberately dangerous. Have you ever tried to do anything meaningful in life? It takes risks. Going back to rebuilding the saxophone, it takes a lot of work to be able to rebuild the saxophone. One, you have to have the knowledge to be able to work on stuff, and not just the knowledge of, say, working on saxophones, but the knowledge of learning how to work on something where you don't have all the information. Again, I wish that I could just get online and buy a new set of pads for a C soprano sax and a new mouthpiece and, a mandrel for it, but you can't. It's different from a B flat soprano. The mouthpiece is a different size. Uses the same side reed, but the chamber inside of it's different. The angle is different. It's an 88-degree angle, which is different than the other. So the tools are different. The pad sizes, they're all weird and obscure, like 9.5 millimeters here. And the low C has a bigger pad than the low B flat. It's insane. But you have to have the skill that looks at that, and that's actually a dangerous thing. And there's a risk in it, right? Trying to repair something like that, you might bust out a soldering joint. And if you want something which is safe and tame, well, you're never going to be able to be there. If you want to get the dent out of the saxophone, you're actually going to have to put a mandrel in there and hammer it. If you want to get the pads fixed, you're actually going to have to disassemble it and cut that old stuff out and then start sewing around with some lambskin and trying to fashion together a new pad that'll seal. To actually build a new mouthpiece for it, you're going to have to start with scratch and do a lot of mathematics and geometry and figure out the ratio between, on the bigger saxophone, how it shrinks down to the mouthpiece, and then do the same difference in volume on this. Like, there's a lot of skills that are involved in that. It's actually a lot of dangerous skills, things that are risky. Sometimes you break a piece like I did. To actually create a world that holds back the void, it has to be dangerous. In order for the rose to survive, it has to have the thorns on it. In order for even, say, a predator to live, it requires a lot of protein, right? It requires a lot of calories. It has to go out and eat other animals. In order for there to be beautiful things in the world, it has to also be dangerous enough to hold back the ugliness. Ugliness is predatory. It's hungry. And in our world, it's easy to actually say, that over there is ugly, but it's altogether different to find and honor which is beautiful. It's easier to take and crush the saxophone that is junk, or to tear down a house or an old car, because I love to work on cars too. I love to work on anything mechanical. It's easier to tear things down and to beat things up than it is to actually build up something which is beautiful. But the saint finds and honors the good. It remembers that there is something holy. One of the things that bothers me the most, and I'm very hard on the Christian academies, is that when I went through the schools and I spent time, I did not walk away. And I was one of the good kids, right? I ended up becoming a pastor, which there's, a low turnout rate of that. Also, it wasn't something I chose, being a pastor. It was more or less, quite literally, the church asked me to. I did not pick it out from a list. I never felt like, this is what I wanted to do. I actually had a lot of other things that I wanted to do, but God lined up this for me, and it's very fulfilling. And just a reminder, we're bad at picking out what is actually meaningful for us to do. We're bad at doing the a la carte. Like, give me a menu of life, and I'm going to pick out what's going to make me happy. We're very bad at that, and oftentimes we don't choose well. But when I walked away from a lot of the higher education, and even a lot of the classes that I go to, which I rarely go to, a lot of the continuing education courses, you don't walk away from anything being holy or sacred. You walk away from it being technical and sociological, and even the people who are staunch enemies of, say, socialism and Marxism, they actually are still operating within that paradigm. Like, we're going to do, the conservative case for, a special scholarship that only goes to, certain groups of people or something like that, where they're actually doing all the things they claim to oppose, but that's because they don't actually know how to taste the poison or open up their eyes. And there's not a lot of meaning in that. And you'll find this in just every sphere. It's not unique to anyone. Now, I would argue that it's particularly heinous in the house of God. You go to Proverbs 25, and I believe it's verse 23, where it talks about, the righteous man who falters before the wicked. That's like a poison or a sullied well. What creates Batman in sort of the DC universe is not the absence of police or the absence of a system of law. It's the fact that the system of law and the police are all corrupt. What's worse than not having institutions to rely on is have those institutions exist enough to be there, but actually not stand for you when you need them to. This is the whole problem with Pontius Pilate, right? Every Sunday we read the Apostles' Creed, and Pontius Pilate gets ripped on for, Jesus suffered at his hands, and he deserves it. Pilate's guilt is actually increased by him taking the non-answer and the non-stance, rather than he just come out and said, yeah, we're going to crucify Jesus. He's the governor of Judea, right? He's the governor there in the Jerusalem region. He's not Herod. Technical details, but Pilate, who's there, Pilate is supposed to make the decision. You're the Roman official. If the man's guilty, you put him to death. If he's innocent, you let him free. And if there's a mob outside, you know what? You shame those Jewish people. They want to have their special day tomorrow. Too bad. You're all locked in your home for, 24, 48 hours. You wanted to have a mob. You send home the soldiers are shutting you down. That's what Pilate's supposed to do. If the man's really guilty, Pilate, you sentence that man to death and you give the punishment out. Pilate doesn't do that. Pilate instead, he washes his hands of it. He's the righteous man, the man with leadership and responsibility that falters when the pressure is put in front of him. He stumbles. And a lot of our leaders do that. And you'll find it everywhere. Just so that we can learn to critically think and argue. And this is actually something that should be its own conversation, so I'll address it again later. So one of the things that's happened in the last few years, and I've already got strikes on YouTube, so I've got to be careful about what I say. I'll speak in code for us. One of the things that's happened when people were forcibly required to take something into their body that they did not want to take, and you probably know what that means, there were a lot of leaders in the church who said, well, everybody, they have these rights, but with those rights come responsibilities. And so, there's a threat on the horizon, so we have to suspend those rights and for the sake of responsibilities. The people who argue that don't actually believe that. Or at least they don't as much as they think that they do. You probably never pin them down and get them to admit they don't believe it, but they've got a flawed line of thinking in their brain. Because what they actually mean is the little people don't get to have the rights. They have to give up their rights for a larger responsibility, but the people at the top of society don't. The doctors who might experiment, they get to have rights. The ones who might try to create a vaccine, say it's as innocent, no man, I said the word. Say it's as innocent as possible. Say that they were actually trying to prevent something from happening, but they played a dangerous game and it went south and things escaped, and now a lot of people are sick. That would be the case where you would say, no, your responsibility to the public, that's too dangerous of a game to play. The risk-weight ratio benefit, you can't do it. But we don't say that. We say, no, you don't have to worry about the responsibility of the public. You have a right to study that, even though it has a great potential to destroy everyone. And you see, they're actually fine with they keeping their rights and throwing away the responsibility, but not the little people. The people, again, you have rights because people at the top of society do make mistakes, and the people beneath them should not be subject to that. They shouldn't be forced to comply with that. You see, they're actually fine. A lot of those Christian leaders who would make those arguments, they're actually fine with people keeping rights and throwing away responsibility, but it's the people above them. So this is where prepositions come in important. If you're beneath them, they'll chastise you and say, well, you have rights and, love your neighbor. Well, you can make that argument when you first say, love your neighbor to the people above you. The prophet doesn't just come to the red light district and chastise the prostitute and the little people. The prophet actually goes over there to the palace and starts, laying on the king. You're not doing the work of the prophet if you only punch downward. And you'll find a lot of these people, they only punch downward because they're like Pontius Pilate. They are the righteous one who falters before the evil. And they are like a poison to the well, because when you actually are wanting people to defend you and you're wanting people to really lead you in an hour of hardship, you don't have them. And that level of hopelessness is what creates like a character Batman in, say, Gotham City. But in the real world, that's what actually creates revolutions and reformations and things like that. That level of hopelessness within the system. And we are there right now. And the people will come along and say, well, no, you need to just believe in this stuff. No, you're not worthy of that. So what we have to do is we have to get back to actually appreciating what is good, true, and beautiful. Remember that the Holy Spirit came for you. And you as an individual, you go to, again, Galatians 6. Yes, you do bear one another's burdens, but you're only capable of doing that. That's Galatians 6:2. If you also have Galatians 6:5, which you first be able to bear your own load. You have to be able to bear your own load. If you're not capable of bearing your own load, you're not going to be able to bear someone else's as well. And you've got to get your life together with Christ, become disciplined in everything worthy, and honor the good. Hunt for it. You've got to go out and bleed to find it. One of the things I love about the King James, and even the New King James to an extent, the NASB a little bit, is that they remembered the hardship of life. Ecclesiastes 3:10, which is one of the most profound pieces of wisdom, philosophy, and revelation that has ever been told to human ears, is that verse which says, I have seen the travail. Something like the ESV might translate as, I've seen the business, which is so tame, but no, the travail. I've seen the hardship, the suffering which God has given to the sons of Adam to be exercised thereon. That verse reminds you that a good life is not a cheap or easy life. It's not one of convenience or preference. Your convenience and preference have very little to do with meaning. But it is one that is colored with sacrifice and valor. It's one that comes with fine sorrow. And the more your eyes are open to see God's goodness, the more you will be burdened by the sights of the world. The travail is a beautiful hardship of living as we ought to live. And we must leave behind the vanity of the world and embrace the high nature of living with Christ. Snares fall into two categories. There are snares which won't let go of us, and then snares which we can't bear to release. I've got so many notes. And I realized we're 45 minutes into this. I think I'm going to leave this conversation there. Actually, no. I do want to go to Psalm 27. I read that all the time. I love it. And I read it all the time because I want people to soak it in. Psalm 27:10, when my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will take me up. In our world, we're commanded to honor our family, honor our parents, because we're in a small way in the image of our parents. In the true and ultimate way, we're made in the image of God. But on a very private level, we also carry our parents' characteristics and, their parents before them. And it all goes back to God, and all glory and all things belong to God. But if you don't honor your parents, you can't love yourself. You can't honor yourself. You won't have a meaningful life. And what happens when the world is broken? What happens if you're a parent who has been sinful to your children? What happens if you're a child and your parents didn't love you? How do you sort that out? Now, our world is designed to encourage that nowadays. And it is, I want to specify, encourage. Encourage it in your family. Don't be ensnared with easy living, but you have to put in the hard work to aspire upwards. The Lord will take you up. It's not optional to view God as the Father. Don't be the arrogant, modern Christian who thinks they're smarter than all of church history and think that I'm going to play with the formula, and viewing God as the Father is an option. It's not optional. Because the psychology of how we relate to the world, you need the love and approval of your Father. And in a world where people are naturally sinful, and it's actually rare to find that good Father, you need God the Father in your life. Now, that's hard to appreciate that, again, when we're so flippant. We can't believe that anything can be sacred. You mean to tell me that one book falling on the floor by accident is worse than another book falling on the floor by wanton will? How could that be the case? Well, because one of those things is sacred and holy, and the other thing is not sacred and holy. And even accidentally dirtying the sacred is worse than intentionally smashing the non-sacred. And again, in the modern church, we look at things and we look at the New Testament, and we've lost our ability to think. We'll read things, it's not, what goes in a man that defiles him, it's what comes out of his mouth. So suddenly it doesn't matter what you eat. Suddenly it doesn't matter. No, that's not true. It's just there's a hierarchy of things. The spirit of things matters more than their material reality, but the material reality is still a material reality, and it still actually has some value. God actually made you with hands. He made you for a domain where you can live and walk. And Jesus does not tell you these things so that you would be dismissive. Again, when Jesus says, if you look at someone with hatred in your heart, you're already guilty of the sin of murder. That is not dismissing murder. And murder is worse than just having an attitude in your heart. And one of the reasons why is there's a person that is now dead. You need to, yes, you wear the sin. When you have that in your heart, that sin is in you. And you have to repent of that fully. It's an extreme sin. But the other person is not dead from your hatred. If you go out and murder them, they are dead. They are removed from this life. That is worse, because the effects are bigger than you. Holiness and righteousness is not just how it's all contained in your life. There are things much bigger than you. But in the modern world, we cannot think anymore, because we believe that reality is just a product of our own will, that it's all what we believe it to be. And even when it comes to how we interpret sin and righteousness, it's now reduced to those things. So we might say, well, I fully bear the sin in my heart, so, how that manifests in the world doesn't matter. Well, actually, yes, it does matter. So tune out the world and listen for God who made you. Don't walk in the darkness. Thank you for joining me. I'm Pastor J. Dylan Proctor. God love you, and have a blessed day.